Welcome back to another episode of FPO&G, Financial Planning for Oil and Gas Professionals. This week on the podcast, we're going to talk about planning for an inheritance. And this will be the first of really a two-part series. I think the first episode will be looking at the giftor, or no, we'll take it, Justin, we'll start with the inheritor. What are the things to think about as an inheritor of potential future assets? And, next week we'll talk about, hey, what are the things to think about as a gifter passing on an inheritance? So, Justin, let's take it from the inheritor's point of view, because a lot of people think about like an inheritance and then they think, oh, I'm probably not going to inherit anything, or oh, I'm financially independent, so like it doesn't really matter. Why should everybody, and especially oil and gas professionals, be thinking about this?
Jared, I would kind of add a whole nother demographic. I think there's also a group of people who think about inheriting and they're thinking, oh man, I can't wait until I can buy this, or that when I inherit assets, which is, when you dive into the weeds of financial planning, it's kind of interesting to think about that perspective, just because that's not really how it works, Jared. As we know, things move way slower than that many times, depending on the asset that is being inherited, depending on the trust language, and the overall estate plan. So there's just so many moving parts. But actually, let's back up. What was your original question with being an inheritor?
No, I just really like, why should everyone be interested in this topic, right? Because like some people might not think it applies to them. Why do you think this is like an important thing to understand, regardless of where you exist on the financial spectrum? Because I would argue, most people have to think about this.
Really interesting question. So maybe on the first front, you could almost say, well, maybe it doesn't apply to everyone. Obviously, there are a ton of people who will never inherit a dime. So they might be sitting there thinking, well, it doesn't apply to me. But Jared, I do think it's interesting that there will be enormous macroeconomic consequences of millions of people inheriting something over the next 20 years. Thinking about the real estate market, thinking about the cost of discretionary or luxury goods that aren't necessarily, things that you need. I think that's going to be kind of a really substantial consequence of the magnitude of inheritance that is already coming and will come. And then, Jared, certainly there's just so many planning items that if you are in the position where you will inherit some sort of asset or assets, there's a lot of things to think through. And so I think it's super fascinating if you're an inheritor, or also really interesting to think about the macroeconomic kind of consequence of what this will look like over the next decade or two.
Yeah. The great wealth transfers, they're talking about tens of trillions of dollars passing to the next generation. So even if you are not in that bucket, that much money changing hands to a different demographic that has different investment priorities and a different time horizon, I think that has macro implications, right? I think we talked about this idea before, but like in some real estate podcasts, we were talking about the number of all cash homes that are being purchased in New York City, right? Like, and the number of people, like it's over 50%. And I think that was 2023 was the year they had data for. And I don't know, how long that's persisted, but that's an insane reality, right? Even if you're not on the inheritor or you're not in the position to make all cash offers, that changes market dynamics. So I think, regardless of whether or not you're inheriting anything, it does change the future world you live in with a great wealth transfer happening.
Jared, I want to pause there. It also changes completely the kind of mortgage credit markets and just how you access financing. So when someone pays cash for a house, well, sometimes they're just paying cash, right? Just let the verbiage do the talking. But Jared, sometimes they're not actually paying cash and they are using a margin loan from a brokerage account. They are using some other private financing instrument. And so it shows up on the kind of closing documents at the title company. It shows up as a cash purchase, but there could be some other form of financing. So it's interesting to think that that also is kind of another consequence of the great transfer of wealth, that, hey, some of the traditional financing vehicles are not, always going to be used.
Yeah. So I think, in summary, hey, this applies to everyone, actually, regardless of whether or not you are an inheritor. But my guess is if you're a listener to this podcast, you will inherit assets in some form or fashion at some point in your life. So I think it's good to just take a step back and say, hey, knowing that even if you aren't, it impacts you. But assuming you are, okay, what are the things that you need to be thinking about? And I think this is an interesting one, especially for some of like our younger clients. Like a really good question to kind of think through is, hey, in light of this future inheritance, do I include this in my financial plan, right? Because on the one hand, it's a very uncertain thing, but depending on the level of assets that you're inheriting, it's probably, it's unrealistically aggressive to make a big, to assume a really big number at a really young age. It's probably also unrealistic to assume no money at any point in time. So do I include that in my financial plan? And does that change how I think about planning for financial independence or sabbaticals or whatever it is somebody's planning for?
It matters so much on the particular asset that is going to be inherited, the magnitude of that asset, and the timeline of that. And then, Jared, I would add maybe the knowability of those first three factors. And so if you think about, are you a beneficiary on a $4 million IRA? Are you the beneficiary on a brokerage account? Or are you, going to have a portion of a trust that is unlocked to you at age 35 and now you're 31 and, this estate that you have a share in is 8 or 9 or 10 figures. So there's an enormous amount of wealth that will be transferred to you. And you are simply waiting for yourself to hit the age where that is unlocked. And so, I mean, Jared, do we kind of dive into each of these individual examples? There is a massive spectrum that you have to think about that question on.
Yeah. I think a good spot is saying, hey, let's, the answer. So I think your answer to the initial question is, do I or do it not include it in my financial plan? And to what extent? Your answer is, hey, it really depends on the assets. So talk about a couple of prominent likely assets you might inherit and then how that might impact, your potential cash flow analysis or how you might think about that related to your financial plan.
Perfect. I think the perspective that we want to apply to this is you need to, at the end of the day, you need to do some sort of risk analysis on what exactly is the likelihood that you're actually going to get this money. So let's start at the extreme end of the spectrum where it's, exceptionally likely that you do get this money. So that would be, maybe your family has a $70 million estate and you will get a third of it, and you get half of your share at age 35 and half at age 40. And let's pretend that the estate is relatively liquid. And so it's not some opaque, privately held business that could become worthless in 2 years. So if that's the situation and you are 31 years old and your first kind of liquidation event inside of the estate plan happens in 4 years at age 35, Jared, that has to be included in your financial plan. That must be an integral part of how you think about how much should you be saving, how much should you be investing, what should your allocation look like, how aggressive should your allocation be. It all depends on the underlying assets inside of the estate that you have a share to. And I think it should also impact how much you spend now. Those are a lot of different points. Where should we kind of dive deeper within those?
That makes sense, right? Like really, like I would almost say like it feels like even less of an inheritance because like it's a gifting of assets, right? With predetermined factors. Like really, you've already inherited the container, which is the trust. There's just parameters for when you gain access to the inheritance.
Good point.
Right. So like that is like probably on one end of the spectrum of like, hey, that's probably easier to say, or the most clearly defined bucket to say, hey, I'm going to include this in my financial plan. And it kind of feels financially responsible. It feels responsible and reasonable to do so. On the other side, what did you say kind of like is a polar opposite of that of like, man, I would be very hesitant to include this in my financial plan or really change my savings rate in light of inheriting this potential asset?
Okay, good question. I'll pick this one. Let's say that you are the beneficiary of your mother's whole or permanent cash value life insurance policy. And let's say that your mother is spending probably more money than she can afford to spend. And you don't know, does she have 2 years left to live or 18 years left to live? And so in that type of scenario, well, you kind of need to understand what is the underlying asset and what is what's the risk analysis? What's the likelihood that this asset stays intact and actually gets passed down to you? Well, if your parent is, kind of running out of assets and they're spending more than they have available, well, then they may need to tap into that life insurance policy. They may need to tap into the cash value. What type of impact will that have on the death benefit? Did they have any outstanding loans? Does the policy have any current loans? Will the policy have any future loans? Will those said loans, what will those loans impact the cash value and the death benefit? And so all of those factors could make it, and Jared, another factor. Okay, what if, let's say that your parent is 89 years old? What if they end up living for another 9 years instead of another 2 years? Obviously, as a family member, that's a great thing, and stuff. But in terms of the financial plan, well, then we have no idea what's going to be left on the death benefit of that policy and how the policy is structured, what the underlying investment exposure is, and the likelihood that it will stay intact. That is really difficult to really figure out, okay, what exactly am I going to inherit? Will there be anything? Will it be the current listed death benefit or something much, much different?
Interesting. And so in that scenario, would you say to ignore it completely from, your own financial projections? And as you kind of begin to map out, hey, kind of do the back of the envelope math of figuring out what you might need to save for retirement?
By and large, yes, I would. I would probably ignore it. What do you think, Jared?
Yeah. I mean, I think it comes down to, right, because also that policy at age 89, where you have a single parent, you have a surviving parent who has maybe 5 to 10 years of life expectancy, is like trying to estimate the range of outcomes related to that policy is even very different than somebody who purchased that policy in their mid 60s for like estate liquidity. And, the point at which you touch that is probably decades away versus years away. So I think, it's pretty much the universal financial planning answer, but I would say it depends. Like in the scenario you outlined, I think ignoring it is kind of the sensible thing to do. Cause, and that's assuming you have a good underlying understanding of you have a policy document, you've seen the, how it's developed, you see the premium paid, you've seen the cash value, you have a good understanding of, the giftor's financial situation and their potential needs to draw down on that asset. But yeah, I think it's a function of, okay, time horizon, how long till I get these assets? What's the probability that I get these assets? And you can increase your understanding of that probability by understanding the financial situation of the people that may gift it to you, right? And of course, I feel like, generationally, I feel like, younger generations are getting more comfortable with talking about money, but, we've interacted with several families that have know they have sizable inheritances coming their way, but really have no quantifiable, they have no idea. They wouldn't be surprised if it was X million or Y million, right? Neither would surprise them. And the lack of clarity on their part is really makes it really kind of hard to plan for. So you kind of have to ignore it.
That's a great point. Jared, there's unknowability in a couple fronts. So just like you mentioned, a lot of children don't have, necessarily some sort of clarity on, hey, do my parents have 200,000 or 2 million? And then there's plenty of people that don't have clarity. Hey, do my parents have 2 million or 22 million, or add another zero on there? And so there can be so much murkiness there. But Jared, there's also an unknowability on, hey, do you actually know your parents' balance sheet and their monthly cash flow? So it's not just, is someone in a good financial situation static today, but are they moving in a good direction, and how fast are they moving in that direction? And so that's just this whole other factor that gets at, you don't know how long someone's going to live. Do you know how much they're spending? Is their withdrawal rate 3% of their assets, or is it 13% of their assets? And so those factors make it to where, yeah, you for my life insurance example, I think you kind of exclude it from your financial plan. Jared, I would say, let's say that there is some unknowability factor, but it's pretty certain that you are going to get some sort of, let's say, brokerage account or retirement account stake in the millions of dollars. Maybe if there are some concerns about, I kind of think my parents might be spending too much, the withdrawal rate could be too high. Maybe you just take a fraction of it for planning purposes. Like we always say, we're CFPs, so we kind of always think through, hey, what's the biggest risk, the worst case, and how do we plan to mitigate that? So I think that's kind of what has to happen.
Yeah. I mean, I would try to know as much as you can. And then I would say apply a healthy discount to that, right? Just to give yourself a margin of safety. But I also think it comes down to really like how comfortable are you course correcting? Right. So like what I mean by that is, hey, if I include it, and then it doesn't materialize in the way that I think it's going to, and that means, I lowered my savings rate over the last 10, 15 years, and then I got to up at the last 15 because in light of that, or maybe work a little longer than I had initially modeled, but I don't really care because I like my job. Or, hey, I really have this line in the sand and I got to be out of here by 60, regardless of whether or not the inheritance materializes. It's also a function of, hey, how comfortable am I course correcting, right? Because the longer you wait, the more information you get. But, again, you have needs in today. So I would say, hey, if you're going to include in your financial plan, it should be a function of, all the things we talked about. What's the probability you get it? What's the type of asset? But then, okay, how comfortable am I course correcting? Because if you're not comfortable course correcting, then, you're probably inevitably going to have to, especially if the inheritance is decades away.
Jared, what's interesting about this is this idea actually applies whether we are talking about an inheritance event in the 6 or 7 figures, but also in the 8 or 9 figures. And so, some of the cases that we think through where there's family members that are going to be inheriting 8 figures or 9 figures, Jared, the ability to course correct and the timing of some of their major purchases is incredibly critical. And so think if you are the beneficiary and you are going to inherit, let's say $45 million. You don't necessarily know whether it's going to be now or in 9 years. Well, you're probably not going to go buy a $20 million ranch that requires $1 to $2 million a year to operate, because that course correction could be really, really, difficult if the event is less than you anticipate, or if that event is much more delayed than you expected it to be. And so understanding kind of the timeline and the magnitude of assets and the liquidity around the assets, it has pretty big consequences. I mean, whether we're talking about smaller numbers or really substantial numbers.
Yeah. I mean, getting kind of to the next point of like, hey, what is the asset I'm inheriting? What's the tax registration of the asset I'm inheriting? Because like those, and that's why you have to have a good understanding of the balance sheet. Because if you say, hey, I'm going to inherit, if I'm going to inherit $1 million in an IRA versus $1 million in a brokerage account, those are mathematically two very different things, right? An IRA you inherit in your peak earning years that you have to take over 10 years because you're a non-spouse beneficiary. Probably 30% of that is going to taxes.
Yeah.
Assuming no estate tax, we'll just ignore that. If you inherit a brokerage account that gets a step up in cost basis and you get $1 million free and clear on day one versus taking over 10 years, that's the exact same dollar figure, but the end net after tax amount you get is two very different numbers, right? And you could take all of it in that first, you could take all $1 million of that in that first year, but then you're probably going to pay closer to 40% tax on that. So, that tax number goes up from, maybe 20% to 40%. So, right, the dollar numbers are the same, but just because of the asset tax registration of those buckets, that has financial planning implications.
Jared, you're right. If you are inheriting, a liquid brokerage account, that is kind of the traditional inheritance that like you think about or see in a movie, where you're a person and now you have millions of dollars just like that. If you're inheriting an IRA, Jared, I would almost completely change the verbiage and label it differently in your mind. You are not inheriting assets. You're not inheriting an asset at all. Instead, you need to think of it as you're inheriting a cash flow schedule over 10 years. And those are just very different in terms of what you do with them and when you can do something with them.
You're inheriting a payment calculation in Microsoft Excel.
Yes, that's so right. We didn't even talk about this prior, but this entire point has me thinking one thing, Jared. Other cultures that live multi-generationally, they've got it right. They absolutely have it right. Like when you're thinking about the way the typical kind of American family is structured, yeah, guess what? There's an enormous amount of unknowability for the vast majority of families in this situation. You don't totally know the assets you're going to get, but let's say that your family did kind of follow some different advice, and they told the kids, "Hey, here's what we have. Here's what you're looking at." You still may have no idea, kind of the balance sheet and cash flow of your older generation. So it's hard to kind of properly analyze the risk associated with what you may or may not inherit. But then, Jared, there's also kind of that element where it's like there's an enormous amount of scams and frauds directed completely at elderly people with assets. So I think there's just something to be said. Like what an incredible setup, what an incredible safety measure to, instead of having this opaque situation where the balance sheet is here and at some point, in 2 years or 20 years, at death, assets will pass down. What a powerful situation to live multi-generationally and just kind of do the asset transfer, if it makes sense tax-wise, a little bit earlier.
We cracked the code. How to optimize inheritance and financial planning. Move in with the people that are going to give you the money.
There you go.
No, but I do agree in the spirit of what you're saying. Like, hey, if there's more candid conversations, and just seeing how they do life, right? If the person you're inheriting the money from is someone who like you don't do life with, you're less likely to have a pulse on their situation.
Totally.
Right. And there's context clues, like people making impulsive buys or really high buys, but absent a balance sheet or a conversation about what's important to them or understanding of their plan, like you're looking at these little micro events. And it may or may not be a false indicator to like, is their plan on track and what does their plan mean for me?
For sure.
So Justin, we talked about, hey, do I include the asset? It really depends on the asset. Also includes the bucket the asset is held in. I would also say it includes like, what is the liquidity and control level of the asset you're inheriting, right? So if you're inheriting a privately held business to which your family is, not involved, like you're on the board, but you might not be some of the key employees, right? Like you might be worth $50 million on paper the moment you inherit that asset, but your ability to monetize that in an accretive way could take decades.
Yes.
Right. And like, okay, hey, I'm inheriting this asset. Okay, when can I eat the financial benefits of that? Right. And it might not make sense for you the moment you inherit the asset to receive it. But I mean, if you are the inheritor, I mean, this is a good time this is why it's helpful to understand the balance sheet of the people that are potentially gifting is, hey, make sure there's liquidity there, right? And that there's conversations about, hey, what do we want to happen to this privately held family business when I'm no longer around? Like, is it important for me for it to live on, right? Do you have no preference? Or, hey, I want them to, monetize that. The surefirest way to make sure that's not a decision is to make sure there's not enough liquidity to cover the estate tax bill, right? And then and then your hands are kind of tied, and you're worth $50 million on paper, and so the IRS, has a big tax bill for you related to estate taxes, but you don't have any money to kind of cover that. So also thinking about, hey, what is the liquidity profile of the assets I'm inheriting? And of course, for that $50 million example, that's a big number, but your access to it, it'd be very irresponsible to just add that to your balance sheet and assume that, hey, the moment I inherit this business, I'm good. Because that might be far from the case.
And let's dive into that. What we're talking about, Jared, is you inherit a share or maybe an entire privately held business. And so then the question is, okay, are you now the operator? Do you want to be the operator? Do you know how to be the operator? Let's say you're not. Let's say it's a minority position in a privately held business. How well do you know the operator? The other owners, how many other owners are there? When do they want to sell? And so there's a lot of questions that get introduced. that at the end of the day, what we're really getting at is you might have a significant inheritance event, but you may not actually experience much of that cash flow for a very long time.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Especially if it's like a privately held business, because you can't just wake up tomorrow and sell those shares on the New York Stock Exchange.
That's right.
Needs to be done prudently and thoughtfully.
To your point, whether you're the operator or whether you are in the business or not, there are just a million potential examples where it would behoove you to hold on to that privately held business for a long time. So, you mentioned this 2 minutes ago, and it is very true. Liquidity may not come for a decade or more. And then creates the problem that you also just addressed. What in the world are you going to do if you owe an estate tax? And is there other liquidity? And so, yeah, so much of financial planning is, hey, how do we properly compound assets? Number one. So how do we keep assets growing? Number two, how do we minimize the present and future tax bill of said assets continuing to grow? And then number three is, how do we overlay those things with appropriate cash flow to even allow compounding to happen? And so, we always love to kind of use that Warren Buffett quote that the greatest, most favorite holding period for an investment is forever. And that's absolutely true. But Jared, in order to hold an investment forever, you better have cash flow that allows you to hold that investment.
Yeah, man, that's the thing is there's just so many things to think about, right? And that's why we had to make a podcast about it, right? It's not as easy as I include it or I included it at a 30% discount rate, right? It's purely a function of what's your capacity to change? What type of asset are you inheriting? What's the timeline to inheriting that asset? What's the risk associated with inheriting that asset? And what visibility do I have on the person that's potentially granting me the asset? And, people could arrive at very different conclusions of how much to include or exclude in their financial plan. But, one final call out here. If you are financially independent, right, you need to be, and you're going to inherit something, that still elicits a conversation, right? Whether it's disclaiming the asset, whether it's updating beneficiaries, right? Like if you are financially independent and you are about to inherit, you can't just ignore this and say, hey, I don't need it, so I don't need to think about it, right? Because, there's consequences to doing that. And so, disclaiming an asset or modeling it, hey, if I do get this asset, what does that do to my potential estate tax liability? So it's, thinking multi-generationally enough to where even if you've said, hey, I built something good for myself. If the reality and the probabilities point to you getting even more and that creating potential downstream consequences, that should be addressed as well.
And Jared, I feel like there's kind of like a subtle undertone in our entire podcast today that is, hey, you might have this big inheritance coming in, but actually you don't. And you need to assume you don't. You need to think that you never will. And, Jared, there is an element where it's like, there's a lot of things, especially if you're 28 or 30 and you're having young kids, where it's like, guess what? Life is pretty stinking hard during that stage. And if you can spend some money to make it a little bit better, you should, especially if there's any sort of inheritance coming.
And that's the thing, Justin. I love that you pointed that out because, if you think about oil and gas professionals, we skew engineer, which skews risk management, which skews Monte Carlo simulation, right? Like the median inheritance value is going to be more than zero. And I will say candidly, in light of who we work with, most people will mention it in passing as though it's not a reality.
Yes.
Right. So the answer is probably, is it worth it to assign the full value to it? Probably that's a little overzealous and irresponsible, but our clients and a lot of our listeners don't really skew that way. They skew overly conservative to where they ignore it probabilistically to where it's not even close to the median scenario. And if you were to run a Monte Carlo analysis, so I that's a good parting encouragement is to say, hey, it'll probably be something. How much, how to include it in your plan is very personal and involves all those things, but it probably should be included in some form or fashion.
That's right. That's absolutely right. Because Jared, it does get at that idea from our podcast and the book Die with Zero. And that main idea is, hey, what's the median asset or median age that most people inherit assets? It's like 59. And by and large, especially, for oil and gas clients we work with, you've got it all figured out by then. And most of our clients at that age, their life would literally not change at all in any way if they inherited a nice sum of money at 59. And so, like I said, life can be really hard when you're young, you're having kids, you're getting things started out. What was that phrase that you used in that? Is it expense smoothing? To kind of, like it's okay to spend a little bit more when you're younger rather than live super cheap. And now you have more money than you could ever know what to do with. And so now you can learn how to spend. And that other idea, Jared, of, hey, your kids are only at a certain age once. And once they're past that age, like it's done. So kind of another reason to loosen the checkbook a little bit and be willing to spend more money there.
Yeah. Like a great example is like, hey, I'm going to wait till my inheritance to take my kids on the Disney trip. And it's like, oh, now my kids are 45 and they're not going to get nearly the level of enjoyment that they would have had I just taken it.
Yes. The like Minnie Mouse dinner experience isn't going to hit at 45 like it does at 5.
Yeah. But again, it's personal. But I think I hope this is helpful just in giving you a framework to how to think about this as an inheritor. Because I think most of us will inherit something at some point from someone. So it's just good to have kind of some tools in the tool belt to begin thinking about, okay, how do I think about this in my situation? And I think two of the big takeaways are, hey, figure out what the asset is, increase dialogue, but also like, don't just act like it doesn't exist, because probabilistically that's not reality. So Justin, I love this conversation. Really good talking about it from the inheritor's point of view. Next week, I think let's talk about it from the gifter's point of view, because it'll be a lot of those kind of tangential conversations, but more, thinking about, okay, what assets do I gift and when? So I think that'll be a good kind of follow-up conversation to this.
I like that. And yeah, we can dive into the grantor perspective, which there could be a little bit of a bridge too. We could also maybe go deeper into, as an inheritor, should you disclaim some of the assets that you might inherit, which would effectively turn you into a grantor in a sense. So I like that.
I love it. Awesome. Well, that's all we got for this week. Hey, by the time this podcast goes live, we'll probably be at 10,000 downloads. So thank you very much. It's been a lot of fun. We love to hear from our listeners, whether it's leaving us a review, passing it along to a friend, sending us an email, asking us for FPO&G merch. We love to hear from y'all. So any ideas or thoughts for future podcasts, podcast@brownleewealthmanagement.com. Thanks for joining us on the ride. We'll talk to you soon.